So how's it going? How's your loved one? How's your day going? How are you doing?
These are all loaded questions with often complex answers. Welcome to the Surviving Alzheimer's podcast. I'm your host, Ken Cardita. In this podcast, I'll share the experiences and lessons learned during the 12-year journey down Dementia Road with my wife, Shanna. It is my desire that you'll find joy and peace while learning to live with your loved one's Alzheimer's disease and not let the disease define you or your loved one. The Surviving Alzheimer's podcast is brought to you by Ascending Minds, LLC. So, how's it going? How's your day going today? How's your loved one? How are you doing? These are all loaded questions with often complex answers as you travel down Dementia Road with your loved ones. These answers can change day to day. Hey, sometimes they can even change hour to hour as you deal with the many changes and unpredictable behaviors that dementia can cause. As caregivers, we often need to remind ourselves that we are dealing with the disease and not our loved one, as we have a front row seat to the multi-act play that is dementia. In today's episode, we're going to return to our backstory. Episode 2 talked about the time before dementia really had an effect on our family and our relationship. Today, we'll take a closer look when my wife Shanna was in the early stage of Alzheimer's, and that time leading up until her eventual diagnosis a few years later. I will share how we dealt with some of the typical and not so typical experiences when Alzheimer's starts to take effect and creates the first of many new normal stages of life for you, and what you'll experience, how you adjust to those stages, and eventually move beyond them to the next stage. So, mild stage Alzheimer's. What is so mild about it? For me, this was a very hard period of caregiving. I think mostly because at this point we had not named it or known what we were dealing with. It was one of the most jarring periods. Everything was so new, and I had absolutely zero experience in dealing with this. And oftentimes, I was very impatient and frustrated, and these were not my greatest moments as a caregiver. It was a key turning point, though. And some of the things that we dealt with that are also pretty common at this stage is the repeating of questions. This was a very dominant theme and experience for us during this period. And it was pretty nerve-wracking to me. At first, it wasn't so bad, but as time went on, it became an everyday, almost every hour experience. And it often got the best of me. It wasn't until much later that I had a sense of empathy and was able to develop patience and not allow myself to be triggered into responding. But during this early stage, this quote-unquote mild stage, this was really tough. We start to see more frequent short-term memory loss. When she was in the MCI or mild cognitive impairment stage, things would happen, but they were random and come and go. At this stage, things became much more frequent, almost regular. Her memory loss was very apparent. She would ask, "What are we doing?" Then she'd ask again, and then we would do it. We would do the activity. And then maybe an hour later, she'd say, "Hey, when are we going to do such and such? When are we going to go somewhere?" And I was still struggling. I would still correct. I would still fill her in and answer her questions. And that, in retrospect, made things harder on both of us because I was very frustrated and it just seemed to confuse her more. Also, you begin to see poor judgment on their end, leading to not so good decisions. For us, these were pretty small. I'd always taken care of some of the major things around the house, like the finances. But I would see her struggle with things, especially things that were sequential tasks. She was still cooking at the early part of this, and she was having trouble following recipes. anything that had a sequence, it was difficult for her. I could remember her looking at a recipe and forgetting where she was, and oftentimes putting in ingredients twice or forgetting an ingredient. It made for some interesting dinners. Another area where I saw this gradual struggle was doing the laundry. She had always done the laundry, and oftentimes she would put dirty clothes into the dryer, or she'd wash some clothes a couple of extra times. A few times she put powdered laundry detergent into the clothes dryer. This meant that I'd have to vacuum it out and clean it out. I remember the first time she did that, I actually got pretty mad and upset. Again, not one of my finer moments. After she did it a few more times, I handled it a lot better. And I think after the third or fourth time that happened, I decided it was time for me to take over doing the laundry, and which was not a big deal. There was a transition period where I would supervise her. I remember she asked me to put up a list of steps, and we had this posted by the washer and dryer, and we go over it with each other. And even then, I would say, now you need to put the detergent in this compartment. And I would show her, and she would struggle. And I just saw her struggle, so I just decided this is something that I should take over, and she shouldn't have to deal with the frustration of doing this. And that's what happened. That was one of the first things that taught me that I would be taking things over, but there should be a transition period. I should help her out as I went, but then when it became too frustrating for her, then I would take over. She also had a difficulty handling money and often misplaced things. There were a few things that she really latched onto, and she would misplace them. One thing that was interesting was she always wanted to have a pair of tweezers around, and it got to the point where she would lose these tweezers a couple of times during the day. In fact, she'd even sleep with the tweezers in her hands oftentimes. I can remember going to bed, pulling them out of her hands and placing them on the dresser next to the bed. I got so tired of looking for tweezers that I went on Amazon and bought a dozen of the exact pair of tweezers and put them in another room so that whenever they were lost, I would just go grab another pair. Again, trying to minimize the frustration was what I was focusing on at this time. Now, there's some other things that are common at this stage. If you go to the Alzheimer's Association website and look up some of the things that are common in early or mild Alzheimer's, they list these things. Wandering and getting lost. We didn't really experience the wandering until much later. I'll talk about that in a later episode. Loss of spontaneity and sense of initiative. In other words, they just lost interest in things. We hadn't quite hit that yet. Mood and personality changes. That would become much more apparent later on for us as well. Depression, boredom, anxiety, and aggression. I didn't see that till much later as well. So, what's it like for the caregiver at this point? I think it becomes very obvious that our loved ones' abilities are changing. A good example of this is Shanna always, her and her sisters and her family, always would have a jigsaw puzzle out on a table. And when they would gather together, they would sit around, do the puzzle, and have conversations and just visit. So Shanna always has done puzzles. Myself, I didn't have the patience for them, so I would let her do that. So before Alzheimer's started affecting her brain, she would easily do 1,000-piece or more puzzles and enjoy it. I started seeing her struggle a little bit. And so I said, hey, do you want some help? So I would sit with her. And over time, I grew to enjoy spending time with her doing puzzles. And we worked together, and we joked and had a lot of fun. And over time, I watched that skill set of hers dwindle away over the years. And during this part of the mild Alzheimer's, I could see her struggling. I could see her losing a little bit of patience and interest, and she wouldn't be able to do it much longer. We then switched to smaller puzzles over time. And then eventually it became where I would have to show her where a puzzle piece would go, and she'd be able to connect them, and I'd say, give me a high five, teamwork. And we could use this to learn how to work together. And sadly, years later, she couldn't even do a very simple child's puzzle. And so you will see this degradation of things that they used to do. It really starts to become very noticeable at this stage. And I think this is where, for me, the mourning and the grieving process started to happen. When you're confronted with the fact that your loved one can no longer do certain things, and you have the realization that no matter how hard you try to help them, you reminders, you create lists, you create visual aids, you finally come to terms that you'll not be able to reteach them the skill that they once had and that it's lost forever. For me, this is when things really started to get very real. There was no denying that she was declining and not recovering as she was where a year or two before she would regain the capability to do things. Now things were steadily declining with no recovery of what was once there. That sense of loss and grief was very devastating for me the first couple of times. And I think these were the things that really made me pressure our neurologist at the time, Dr. G, to really give me some answers of, I'm seeing all of this dramatic change and it's much more frequent. What's going on? And he just continued to tell me she's too young for Alzheimer's. We will just up her antidepressant to try and relieve the anxiety. And I was like, no, it's more than that. And that's eventually what led me to fire him and find another doctor. I'll talk more about that in the next episode. One thing I do want to acknowledge at this time, and even all throughout, Shanna, even though she would be frustrated when these things were happening, and a few times she would get sad and depressed over things, but overall, by and by, as she started losing these skills, she had a pretty good attitude about it. She was really happy and allowed me to help her. And this was a period of time where we really learned how to work well together. As I look back on this time, there's some really good memories in all of this. Some examples of this. We would go to a restaurant and having her order her food was increasingly more difficult. I was reminded of this morning when I visited a breakfast restaurant that her and I went to a few times. And I was just thinking back on all the different experiences we had there. At the very beginning of all this, as the waiter would come to the table, I would let them know. I said, my wife will need a lot of extra time to decide, and please be patient when you take her order. As time went on, it became increasingly difficult for her to read the menu and understand all the different options. It seemed to be very confusing to her. So the next step, I would read the menu and remind her of some of the things that she really liked, and she would often choose one of her favorite dishes. And when that became too hard for her to make a decision in front of the waiter, I would get her order and talk to her about it before the waiter came over. And then I would remind her and allow her to tell the waiter what she had decided. Next, it became a lot easier for me just to give her 2 and 3 options and let her choose, and then tell the waiter. And towards the end, I would just suggest something that I knew she would like, and she would agree. Eventually, it just turned to me ordering for her without troubling her with the stress of making a decision. And this sequence probably lasted a couple of years from beginning to end. Another thing that you'll deal with during this time is, I'll call it social awkwardness. When our loved one first starts to show these signs of not being able to follow the conversation or maybe say something out of context, and eventually the filter gets removed and they'll say whatever they see or is on their mind. And it could be embarrassing sometimes. I remember a few times when someone who was very obese and overweight would come into our sign of view, she would point and say, wow, that person's really fat. Why is that? And I would just hope and pray that person didn't hear it. We'd be in social settings and we'd be with friends and we'd all be having a conversation. She would start to say a sentence and not be able to finish it. And then she would kind of look at me. I started developing the habit of completing her sentences for her. And it was really cute. She would always just smile at me, and then I would be able to help complete her thought. And when we first started doing this around our friends and family, it was a little awkward, uncomfortable for them. I would usually take them aside and explain, yeah, Shanna's having a tough time with some of her verbal skills. And again, we didn't have a name for this yet. And so a lot of times people say, what does she have? I really don't know. We're trying to figure that out. So it was a little frustrating as well. So looking back, I realized that over time, you just have to learn to adapt and adjust to whatever our loved one is capable of doing. And as a caregiver, we need to walk the fine line of helping while allowing our loved one not to be embarrassed. It always has amazed me that something as simple as ordering a food at a restaurant could become such a delicate and ever-changing experience. I would soon learn that this type of flexibility and sensitivity would be needed more and more as time went on. But in the early stages, we were still trying to figure things out. Well, something that I experienced at this time that is very common in caregivers is feeling anger. I became very angry at this time. I didn't really become angry with Shanna. I was angry with the situation. I was still reeling over being forced to retire. I wasn't too happy about that. I wasn't too happy about what was going on with Shanna. And at times I would lose my patience and say things that I regretted out of anger. Now let's stop for a moment and take a look at, where does anger come from? My experience with anger is, if you really look at it, often behind the anger is fear. So anger to me is the expression of fear. Now, you may not realize what you're afraid of, but it's what causes the anger to rise to the surface. I think for us, some of the fears that I was experiencing at that time was not knowing what we were dealing with. There was no official diagnosis. We couldn't name it. And I had no clue how long this might go on for. At this point, I was totally uneducated and imagined all kinds of scary things. I was questioning, can I handle the duties of the caregiver? How long, how much will I have to do? Who could I turn to for help when I will need help? I had all these questions, didn't have any answers to them. This often leads to asking, why is this happening? Why is this happening to my loved one? Why is it happening to me? It's just not fair. This isn't what retirement was supposed to be. I feel cheated. These were questions that came up in my mind. Earlier in my life, decades before, I'd gone through some very challenging times, raising some of my teenage sons, and also some things in my life that caused me to ask the why me question. One of the things that I learned back then that really helped me out at this point when I started asking these questions, these why questions again, is I learned there's a better question than why. And that question is, what do I need to learn from this experience? But first, I had to get past the denial and start to accept things as they really were before I could ask that better question. And that has been how I've dealt with most of the stress of being a caregiver and all of the difficult things. Whenever I catch myself leaning towards the why or having a little pity party for myself, I say, wait a second. There are things for me to learn. And that has made a huge difference. So if you're experiencing some of these things that are common in the early stages of dementia, if I were coaching you through this, I would ask you some of these questions. So ask these questions to yourself. First off, is there any diagnosis? Do you know what you're dealing with? If not, ask yourself, where are you in this process? What are your next steps? Are you working with your medical team to do the proper testing that would help you get to some answers? If you do have a diagnosis, what do you know about the type of dementia that your loved one has? Have you started to educate yourself? I remember when Shanna was eventually diagnosed, I was a little bit afraid to find out what was ahead. I was hesitant. But after I got to a better level of acceptance, I was able to jump right in and really start learning all that I could to help prepare myself. So give yourself some time here. If any of these type of questions make you fearful or uncomfortable, try and describe that feeling. Does it feel heavy to you? Does it drag you down? These are often clues there's some fear behind all this. Are you experiencing any anger? If so, what triggers the anger? Who is that anger towards? Ask yourself, why do you think you're feeling this anger? What might be the underlying fears that you have? Can you give it a name? I find often when we can name the thing that we're afraid of, we can better confront it. Because this is a podcast and basically a one-way conversation, we really can't go back and forth to dig deeper past some of these initial questions. I would invite you to write down your answers and revisit them. And you will find that if you do this when you're in a calm state of mind and you can reflect back, your mind will give you some answers. You'll get a more balanced perspective than if you would say answering these questions right after an episode that caused you to be frustrated or was draining your energy due to caregiving duties. Then ask yourself some follow-up questions until you start to see what might really be causing your fear and anger and any other negative emotions, with the goal of being able to try and name it. And at this point, it will be helpful for you to find someone who you can talk with about all of these things and assist you in helping figure them out. Because if you keep these negative emotions bottled up inside of you, it's going to build up to a point where you'll explode and you'll erupt, and typically with an outburst of anger, and typically you'll regret that outburst, making yourself feel like you're a terrible caregiver. And this cycle just will continue and continue unless you can release those negative emotions. I know for me, I eventually met with a grief counselor and a faith-based life coach, and this helped me through much of this. But unfortunately for me, it was way late in our experience that I started this. It was not until a few years after the early stages that I sought help. And I often wonder if I would have sought help during the early stages, how different things might have been. Even though it would not have changed Shanna's progression with the disease, it would have helped me to cope with things during the experiences of early Alzheimer's and allowed me to cope with things better. And I think the stress and being able to handle it would have been improved, and that would have made able to be more patient and understanding and a better caregiver earlier on, and most likely would have made it a little easier for Shanna. At the very least, it would have spared her from many of my numerous apologies. My coaching advice would be find someone who you can confide in and trust, and allow you to express your feelings without any judgment, and to offer you advice and support for what you're dealing with. It's never too early to start doing regular self-care. Well, today we covered some of the common things that you may encounter during the early stages of Alzheimer's. And if, like us, you may not realize where you are in this process, you may not have a diagnosis, you may not know where you are at the moment. And if this has helped you to realize that maybe what you're experiencing might be the early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, I would encourage you to seek to get a diagnosis. I also hope that some of the examples from our experience might be helpful to you and give you some idea of how you might manage through some of the negative emotions that you'll experience in the early stages of your caregiving career. Finally, if you learn one thing today, don't wait to get support for yourself and do not procrastinate self-care. Once again, thanks for spending time with me. And please share this podcast with anyone that may benefit from it and from what we discussed today. I recently created a Facebook page for the purpose of getting feedback from you. If you go to Facebook and in the search bar type in the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast and hit the search button, you'll find our page. Please follow the page and leave comments, as I would really like to hear your feedback on this episode and any of the other episodes that you've listened to. So today, we dipped our toe into what it was like to be in the early part of this journey. From time to time, I will revisit this time period of our journey and some of the lessons that I learned. But our next episode, I will share with you how we arrived at a diagnosis, how we reacted to it, and how it changed things for us. Thanks for watching an episode of the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast. If you're new to this podcast, I recommend watching episodes 1 through 13 in order so that you can learn our backstory. This will make understanding later episodes much easier. To help you with this, you'll find a link to a playlist called the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast by episode order in the video description and on the Surviving Alzheimer's YouTube channel. The mission of the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast is to educate and inspire caregivers, family, and friends who are on their own unique journey down Dementia Road with their loved ones. I would really appreciate it if you could share this episode to anyone who you feel would benefit from it. Additional ways for you to help us reach others are to hit the like button for this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to be notified of new episodes. All of these actions will encourage the YouTube algorithm to share this episode and podcast to other potential viewers.